Today we're diving deep into academic research, but not the research itself. This time we're looking at the researchers.
Yeah.
The people doing the research.
Yeah.
You shared some excerpts from a 2024 Polish study called Science for Society. And it's got some pretty surprising findings about who stays in academia, who leaves, and why.
It does. The Science for Society report kind of takes a look at the bigger picture of scientific careers. And they do it in an interesting way using big data.
Oh, wow.
They actually
Big data. So
Yeah.
how do they even...
They use data from this global database of research publications called Scopus.
So Scopus basically becomes like a tracking system for researchers' careers then.
Exactly. They can follow their publishing activity, see who's actively publishing and who seems to have left the field, giving a unique view of the trends in research careers.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things they're finding?
Yeah.
What's the story that the data is telling?
Well, one of the most surprising things is how many scientists actually leave research. It's a lot more common than you might think.
Really? Like how many are we talking?
A third of scientists leave research within the first 5 years, and half are gone within a decade.
Wow. Those numbers are way higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of turnover.
Yeah, and this applies to both men and women. Yeah.
A third in the first 5 years and half within a decade. So
Yeah.
what does that mean for science as a whole? Does that mean
Right.
that there's this constant brain drain happening?
It definitely raises some questions about what this constant churn means for scientific progress. Does it impact the types of research being pursued? These are things we need to consider. One theory the report explores is this idea of a push and pull phenomenon.
Push and pull. So you're saying like something's pushing researchers out of academia and then something else is pulling them away. So what are some of those push factors?
Well, on the push side, you've got things like lack of funding, limited job security, the intense pressure to publish, and just a very competitive environment overall.
I can imagine all of that would be pretty demoralizing, especially for early career researchers.
Yeah, it can definitely lead to burnout and disillusionment with academia for sure.
Yeah, I bet. And then what about the pull factors?
Yeah.
What's luring people away from research?
We're seeing a booming tech industry right now, which often offers higher salaries, more flexible work arrangements,
Right.
and what some people might see as a faster path to impact.
That makes sense. Especially if you're feeling burned out from the academic grind. I can see how that would be really tempting. So it's not necessarily that academia is becoming less attractive, but maybe the competition for talent is just getting a lot fiercer.
That's a good way to put it. It's a changing landscape.
Okay, so getting back to the report's findings,
Mm-hmm.
how did they actually go about determining who left science? Like, is there some kind of official exit survey for researchers?
Right. It's not quite that straightforward. They use something called survival analysis, which is a statistical technique to understand how long something survives before a certain event occurs.
I never know that way.
Oh, yeah.
So how does that apply to researchers?
It's actually commonly used in medicine, like to study how long patients survive after a diagnosis. But in this case, they applied it to scientists.
So instead of patients, we have scientists, and instead of death, we have leaving research.
Exactly. By applying this survival analysis to the Scopus data, they could study how long researchers remained active in publishing before dropping off. Basically treating leaving research as the event in their analysis.
That's pretty clever. So they're not literally tracking every single researcher, but they're using this statistical method to get a sense of the overall trends.
Right. It's a way to look at the big picture.
So this approach is revealing a pretty nuanced picture of researcher retention. And I'm guessing things get even more interesting when you start looking at gender.
You're right. There are some intriguing findings. When they broke things down by gender, there were some counterintuitive results. For example, in fields with a higher percentage of women like biochemistry, neuroscience, and pharmacology, women were actually less likely to stay in research compared to men.
Wait, really? That's surprising. You'd think that fields where women are well represented would be more supportive and therefore have better retention.
You'd think so, right? But that's not what the data shows.
So what did they find in fields that are more male-dominated?
In fields like physics, where women make up a much smaller percentage of researchers, men and women left at almost the same rate.
Huh. So that really throws a wrench in the simple narrative that women are leaving because of a lack of representation.
It does. It suggests that there are other factors at play, possibly those push and pull factors we talked about earlier.
So maybe there are more opportunities outside of academia in those fields that are attracting women away. Or are there other factors within academia that are pushing women out of research even when they're in the majority?
That's a question worth exploring further.
It definitely is. The report doesn't seem to give us all the answers, but it raises a lot of important questions about what it takes to build a thriving and inclusive research environment.
Absolutely. It challenges us to think deeper about these issues.
For sure. This is turning out to be a much more complicated picture than I initially imagined. There's clearly a lot more to unpack here.
There is.
So before we go any further, I think we need to shift gears a bit and talk about the flip side of this equation. The new generation of researchers entering the field.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive into that.
Okay, so we've been talking about scientists leaving research. But what about the new generation coming in? Are there new researchers ready to take their place, particularly in STEM fields?
Yeah, the Science for Society report actually offers some encouraging data there. They found globally there's been an increase in the percentage of women researchers across all STEM fields from 1990 to 2021.
That's good to hear. So there's progress being made. But is this across the board, or are there still areas where women are underrepresented?
It's not a totally uniform trend. While there's been overall growth, the report does point out this persistent gap in those math-intensive fields we talked about: computer science, engineering, math, and physics.
Right, the big four. It's interesting how those fields seem to be lagging behind. What does the report say about the growth in those areas?
It's pretty slow, unfortunately. They even give this kind of stark example. At the current rate, it would take over a century for engineering to reach gender parity.
A century. Wow, that's pretty discouraging. What's contributing to this slow growth in those particular fields? Is it simply a matter of time before those numbers catch up, or are there other things going on?
The report highlights a pretty interesting finding here. It found that the percentage of young women researchers in 2021 was actually smaller compared to 2000, while the percentage of senior women researchers increased.
So women who entered academia a couple of decades ago are staying, but fewer women are entering these fields now.
Exactly. And that suggests something might be changing. It's not necessarily that women who are already in research are leaving at higher rates. It's that fewer women are choosing to enter these fields in the first place.
That is fascinating. Is the report able to shed any light on why that might be?
It's tough to say definitively. They acknowledge that the Scopus data doesn't tell the whole story. There could be young women researchers working in areas or regions that aren't well represented in Scopus.
Right.
However, the report does bring up some potential factors that could be influencing these trends.
Like what kind of hypotheses do they offer?
Well, societal and cultural factors could be a big one. You know, maybe there are shifting perceptions of STEM careers among young women. Perhaps they're seeing more opportunities in fields that are perceived as more socially impactful. Or maybe they're looking for better work-life balance.
It's true that STEM fields, especially the math-intensive ones, have a reputation for being incredibly demanding.
Yeah.
And competitive.
Right. And there's still the issue of implicit bias and stereotypes. You know, even if more women are entering STEM fields in general, they might still face subtle barriers that discourage them from pursuing research careers.
So it's not just about getting women into STEM programs. It's about creating a culture where they feel supported.
Yeah.
And empowered to pursue research.
Absolutely. The report talks about the need for strong mentorship and role models, especially for women in those math-intensive fields where they're underrepresented.
Yeah. Seeing someone like yourself succeed in a field can be so powerful.
For sure.
And we can't forget about those external pull factors either, right? Like, how might those be playing a role?
Right. The booming tech industry is a prime example. With its high salaries and often more flexible work arrangements, it's becoming a very attractive option for STEM graduates, both men and women.
Yeah. So maybe those pull factors are getting stronger. Academia needs to figure out how to stay competitive, not just in terms of pay, but also in the overall work environment and culture.
That's a key point. If we want to attract and retain top talent in research, we need to create an environment where people feel valued, supported, and empowered to do their best work.
Absolutely. It seems like the academic world needs to adapt to keep up with the changing landscape of opportunities and expectations. But before we get into potential solutions, I think it's important to take a step back and acknowledge the positive trends that the report does highlight.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
We should celebrate the progress that is being made.
It's easy to get caught up in all the challenges, but it's important to recognize the positive trends that are emerging. What are some of the bright spots that stood out to you in the Science for Society report?
Well, one of the most encouraging things is this trend of decreasing isolation for women in those math-intensive fields.
Oh, that's...
Even though the overall numbers are still low, women are becoming less isolated within their departments and research groups.
So there's a growing sense of community and support then.
Exactly. As more women enter these fields, they can build those networks, collaborate with each other, create a more inclusive environment.
It makes sense. It's got to be easier to thrive when you don't feel like you're the only one navigating those spaces. Does the report talk about how this increased collaboration is impacting the research itself?
Yeah, they actually suggest that this trend is leading to greater visibility and impact for women's work.
That's fantastic. So not only are they supporting each other, but they're also raising each other up and amplifying each other's voices.
Exactly. And that's crucial for creating a more diverse and representative scientific community. I mean, after all, the best science comes from bringing a variety of perspectives to the table.
You've hit on a really important point there.
Yeah.
It's not just about fairness or representation. It's about the quality of the science itself. Having a more diverse range of researchers leads to more innovative and groundbreaking discoveries.
I totally agree.
It seems like this deep dive into science for society has really underscored that connection.
It really has.
We've covered a lot of ground here, and it's clear that the research landscape is evolving. There are both challenges and opportunities on the horizon. So for our listener, what are some of the big takeaways you hope they walk away with?
I think this report really challenges some of those common assumptions we have about why people leave research.
Like the idea of the leaky pipeline.
Right. The leaky pipeline suggests that women are leaving mostly because of these internal barriers within academia. They're being pushed out.
Right.
But the Science for Society report, with its focus on these push and pull factors, adds a whole new dimension to the story.
It's not just about fixing what's wrong with academia, but also recognizing that there are other attractive options out there.
Exactly. And that's true for both men and women. Leaving research is pretty common regardless of gender.
So reframing the conversation is key. This is not just a women in STEM issue. It's a broader issue of talent retention within the entire research enterprise.
That's a great way to put it.
It makes it even more crucial for academia to adapt. We need to make research careers more attractive, not just financially, but also in terms of work-life balance, recognizing diverse contributions, and creating a more supportive culture overall.
You got it.
I think these are some really valuable insights that the report brought to light, and it's food for thought, not just for people in academia, but for anyone who cares about the future of science.
It really is. This deep dive has really shown us how complex the academic landscape is and how that complexity impacts who ends up pursuing knowledge.
Absolutely. And it sounds like the main takeaway here is that the future of research depends on creating a more equitable and inclusive environment, one that attracts and retains the best minds regardless of gender.
I couldn't agree more.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So for our listeners, as you continue on your own paths, whether it's in academia or beyond, think about what role you can play in building that more inclusive and supportive environment for everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep.